What's up everybody, EJ here, and in this video I'm going to give you a little introduction to the new Cinema 4D Softbody simulation system. We'll start out by showing you the difference between cloth and softbody, then we'll cover the most important softbody settings, then we'll learn how to inflate softbodies, and then cover some gotchas and best practices. Now if you want to follow along, you can support me by grabbing the project files for this tutorial. You can find the link to those files in the description below. All right, let's go make some things squishy. All right, so let's get to making some squishy things with some softbody here. So here is my scene. I'll hit NB just so you can see what's going on here. Show you the subdivisions here. You can see I have a fairly low poly object, and we'll talk a little bit about mesh density and how it affects softbody a little bit later. It's best to have a lower poly object as low as you can get, and then I'm just going to subdivide that after the simulation. So I'm going to right click on the prong object here, go to simulation tags, and I'm actually going to start out with cloth just to show you the difference between cloth and softbody. So they all live in the same tag here. You can see softbody, and here's all the cloth settings. If you want to learn more about cloth, definitely check out my tutorial on cloth. But if I go ahead and I want to make sure that this object, if I just hit play here, it's going to fall through the floor. So need to make sure this plane object is a collider. So right click, simulation tag, collider. And then if I hit play now, you can see that basically what is going on is that if you have cloth simulation, it's just going to be a hollow cloth object, okay? And you can turn on balloon to give this a little bit more structure and to fill it up. But at the end of the day, it's just a hollow, filled with hot air type of thing. There's a joke there somewhere. Maybe I'm full of hot air a lot of times. But, and this is a reoccurring theme here. Balloon is very unstable. You see all this popping. You need to go into your control command D, your scene-wide simulation settings. You need to up the smoothing iterations here to smooth things out, and that slows everything down, and sometimes that doesn't even work. Balloon could be a pain in the butt sometimes. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's basically your cloth there. Now we have a different way to be able to make this object a little bit more solid. So if I go to softbody and turn that on, you're going to see all of these little poles. Let me hit N and then A to get back to garage shading with outlines. And you can see all these lines. These are called poles, and these are basically structural support for your object. And if I hit play, you can see that everything has, it's a little more stiffer. It has a little bit more structure, and the structure is created by those poles. So everything's running a little bit slow, so let me just reset all these values here. Let me even bring the subsets down a little bit there to make the simulation run a little bit faster. But the nice thing about everything being the same tag is you can use some of the bendiness values, the stretchiness values of cloth and combine it with softbody. So the difference between these settings here and the softbody settings is they're creating relationships two different ways with your object. So if I grab my doodle tool, the options in the surface here, which is all the cloth settings, they're creating relationships between neighboring points, okay? So connections between neighboring points, while softbodies are creating relationships, if you follow some of these poles, from one point on one side of the object to one point on another side of the object. So that is where the relationship between a softbody support is versus the cloth objects here, because these allow neighboring points to fold or stretch further out or bounce, while the softbody ones control the interaction between one side of an object to another. So I'll delete my amazing little doodle there. And one thing I want to show you is that if I delete this softbody object and you can just go and grab a simulation tag, softbody object, and that's going to have softbody already turned on. And what you'll notice is that by default, all of the cloth bendiness, all that stuff is turned to 0. Okay, so if you want a little bit of bendiness, you'll need to dial that in manually. But let's just talk about the softbody tab right here. So first thing is the draw, and that's basically these little poles, whether they're drawn all the time or just when they're selected or they're just off. I like to keep them when selected, so if I click off, you don't see them. If you click on the tag, you see them. Next up is the softness, and softness is basically the elasticity of these poles. Are they going to squash and stretch more or less? So if I bring this value down to 0 and hit play, you're going to see that the elasticity of those poles is lesser. And if I up this to say 2222, you can see that there's a lot more give, a little more squash and stretch elasticity to those poles, okay? So a lot of this is controlled by the softness. Target length are covered a little bit later, but let's go ahead. Let me reset this to 100, and let's go back to the pole area here because this is also very, very important. So first off, if I just rewind here, we have the amount of poles that are shooting out from each point. And again, depending on the density of your mesh, you might have more or less poles to begin with because by default, you're only shooting out one pole per point. So if you had a denser mesh, you'd have a lot more of these poles by default. But if you want to add more poles, add more structure, you can do that here. And if I hit play, you can see how this is a little bit more dense. Let me up that even more to maybe 12. You can see what that looks like. And then we can even bring the softness down to 0. You can see that looks like a pretty squishy object, but it's definitely a lot stiffer than it was before. So another option here is the minimum length. So you can kind of adjust the threshold of which poles are actually being used. So you can see if I up this, we're only getting the longest poles that are shooting from a point here to a point all the way over here. And those are the ones that are being activated. If I hit play, you can see what that kind of looks like. This looks like, you know, hard spaghetti or something like that. The poles on the inside. We'll just bring that back down to 0 so we have all the poles. Next up, we have the spread. So this is just kind of spreading out and fanning out those where those rays are kind of shooting from one point to another. And then we have the overall pole density. So if we lower the density, we'll have less poles and we'll have a little bit more give to this object here. Okay. Now, another important thing here is the shoot side and the hit side. And by default, we have back and back, which means that the poles are going to shoot on the back side of the polygon. So from right here to the back side of the polygon over here. And so that's the shoot side and the hit side. Now, if we wanted to say have some poles from here to here, so some outside structural support, we would need the shoot side to be from the front of the polygon and have the hit side also be the front of the polygon as well. So if we do front and front, you'll see all of these relationships on the outside, shooting from the outside to the outside of the other side of the object. And if we up the density here, delete that doodle, hit play, you can see that now we just have structural support on the outside. Now, if we wanted both, we can choose both, and we'll have outside and inside support here. So there's a lot of control over how you want the structure of your soft body to be here. Now, one very important aspect to soft bodies and how they look is the density of your mesh. Because remember, however many polygons you have is going to control by default how many poles you have. So if I hit NB, you can see that we have the same density of mesh here and the same soft body settings. But if I use a remesher to up the mesh density of this object right here, you can see we have 5 times the density. And if I go ahead and just apply this soft body tag to this remesh, and we'll just go ahead and current state to object that, and we'll delete the remesh. So we have this higher poly object. And if I select this soft body tag, you'll see that something weird happened. We're having the shoot side on the outside. Sometimes that happens. Just hit refresh and it will update. But you can see all of the poles on the inside versus this one because we're only shooting 1 pole per point, but this has a lot more points because there's a lot more mesh density. And if we just have the same soft body settings here, and I hit play, let's hit N and then A, you can see how terrible this looks. So the more poles you have, the more you might have gaps within your setup where you have these little like weird dimples. And you can try to prevent that with the spread here, but I've just found that it's really hard to get rid of those weird dimples, and the poles are kind of looking like they're poking out a little bit there too. You can go and hit Command or Control D to go to your scene-wide simulation settings. You can try to up the sub-steps here and the smoothing iterations and some of the damping to try to mitigate all the pokey poles and stuff like that. But and that's kind of working there. But also when you up the sub-steps, you're upping the stiffness of your simulation. So let's lower that a little bit. And once you do that, you just start seeing some of those little dimples occurring. So it's a little bit of a pain to get an object with a high density mesh to look good with soft bodies. I found most of my success with lower poly objects. Now, what if you just have a high poly object to begin with? You're like, well, I wanted to make it squishy. How do I do that? Well, that's where you can use a mesh deformer to have a low poly object drive a high poly object. So if I have this high poly little gizmo here, what I'm going to do is I'll just create an instance of it and then throw that in a volume builder. And what I'm going to do is also add a dilate and erode. And what a dilate and erode does is you can offset basically those voxels. And if we mesh those voxels, you can see that I'm basically just growing and expanding out that mesh using that volume builder. So we want to make a nice little cage by using that dilate and erode. You can see the voxel size fairly low. And then we can go ahead and use the magical remesher to bring down that mesh density to 10% of its original density. And you see we have a low poly version of this high poly object. So what I'm going to do is make this editable. So I'll right click, go to current state to object, and there is my low poly proxy. And I'll just deactivate the remesh, all that stuff if we need to come back to it. Okay. And so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to use this low poly proxy to have the soft body dynamics applied to it. Okay. And then to drive the high poly object with this low poly version, which will be much faster to simulate and all that kind of stuff, what we're going to do is we're going to go into the deformers menu and we're going to grab a mesh deformer. And we're going to make this a child of the high poly object. And this is where you define the low poly cage that you're going to use. And that is going to be this object right there. So you can see it's kind of covering up the high poly mesh there. But if I just go ahead and on the mesh deformer, drag and drop the low poly mesh into here, define that as the cage, and I'm going to hit initialize. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a display tag that's going to make the shading mode turn into outlines. And then at this point, what I can do is hit play. And what you're going to see is that the high poly mesh is getting distorted and deformed based off of the low poly mesh here. So this is one way, if you have a high poly object, you can add soft body, make it squishy using this low poly proxy. And if you want to learn more about the mesh deformer, I also did a tutorial on that. I'll link to that mesh deformer tutorial, but it's very, very helpful when it comes to simulations, especially soft bodies where you have all these weird issues with those poles. By the way, if you're new to Cinema 4D or you want to get a little bit more in depth into learning Cinema 4D, check out my courses over at schoolofmotion.com. If you use promo code EYEDESYN100, you can save $100 on either of my Cinema 4D courses. All right, let's get back into it. Now, if we go to this other project here where I just have like a bunch of spheres, I'm using hexahedron type to be able to subdivide them because you want a nice evenly subdivided sphere or mesh. So if you had a standard, it would not do that. You'd have a higher density mesh here, and that would just create a whole lot of issues when it came to soft bodies. So you want to use hexahedron here. And then you can see these little plus signs that I made as well. I can run through how I built those really quick. You can see all the density of the meshes are fairly uniform as well. They're all like in the Goldilocks zone of mesh density. They're not too dense and they're not too low poly. They're just right. But to build that little prong thing, basically have some capsules here, threw it in a volume builder. You can see I'm using that dilate and erode again, which you can find right here, which basically just expands everything out, thickens everything. And then I used an SDF smooth to smooth everything out. And then I meshed that. And then I just remeshed that as well to create a low poly version. Now, the nice thing about the remesh is if you have a fairly symmetrical object, you can see that sometimes you might get not the greatest mesh, but if you turn on the symmetry, these will be perfectly symmetrical. And this is really important if you're going to UV unwrap this or do loop selections. Using these symmetries will make loop selections much, much easier. But this is just an easy way to make these kind of objects. Let's just say you had a capsule as well, By default, the capsule is a higher density mesh at the top and bottom. If you just throw this capsule in this volume mesher setup, it's more evenly subdivided, so that's really, really handy. But then once you like the look of your object, you just right click and go to current state to object, and that'll create a version of that mesh. So this is like the little nubbins. I don't know what else to call this. It's got all the 4 nubbins on the outside, but you can also go and just create a plus sign by just removing that capsule, and then just right click, go to current state to object, and then there is your plus sign that you can go and then just add to your main box scene. Now, another thing when it comes to any kind of dynamics, whether it's pyro, whatever, you want to take scene scale into account, or object scale into account. So I get my figure object bob. You can see that these are about the size of like your Bozu ball, your workout squishy ball kind of thing that some people sit on. I don't know why you would sit on a squishy sphere all day. I bet Nick did that at some point, Grayscale Gorilla. He likes squishy spheres. But anyways, let's go ahead and let's put all of these objects inside of a box and have them kind of like expand and squish and move all around. So what I'm going to do is create a box, which is the easiest step of this process. And what we're going to want to do is go and utilize all of our 4-up views here. And we want to make sure that no objects are kind of sticking out of the box, because if they are intersecting the box, they're going to get stuck and attached to the box. So you do not want that once you apply the simulation. And now what we can do is, just like that mesh deformer applied that display tag to show the wireframes, we're going to do the same thing. We'll go to render tags, go to display, then we'll check on use and just use the lines. So now we just see the outline cage of our cube, and then we'll right click, go to simulation tags, and make this a collider. Now, we have all these objects here. We don't want to apply Softbody tags to each and every one of these. We want to have one tag to control everything else. And how we can do this is by throwing all these objects into a connect object, which is like the Swiss Army knife of Cinema 4D. And basically what it does is, if you make a bunch of these objects a child of this connect object, it's going to kind of treat everything as a singular mesh. So all I need to do is, I'm just going to uncheck weld, because I don't want to weld these objects together. I just want everything to kind of be treated as a singular mesh. And what I can do at this point is, on the connect object, go to simulation tags and apply Softbody tag. And you'll see that this is going to apply Softbody dynamics to all of the objects within this connect object here, which is really nice. Now, if we go ahead and we hit play, let's just go to our main view here, hit play. Everything is just going to fall, and it looks like everything's falling out of our cube here. Why is that? Well, if we look at our collision tag here, the collider side is the front of the polygons of this cube, which means objects are going to only collide with the outside face of this box. But if we want these objects to collide to the inside face of the box, we need to choose collider side back, okay? And once we do that, you'll now see that everything is trapped inside the box. Mwaha, we got all these squishy things inside of my box. And we can also go ahead and everything's just kind of collapsing down. What we can do is turn off gravity altogether, so things kind of are all floaty. So let's Command or Control D to go to our scene-wide simulation settings and just zero out gravity in the scene option here. We can also maybe lower the substeps. Remember, substeps controls the stiffness of any simulation, whether it's soft bodies or cloth. So the lower the number, the squishier your object, the higher the substeps, the more stiff your object will be. If we had any issues with collisions, we could up these as well, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So let's go ahead and let's hit play. And with no gravity, you can see that a couple spheres are just kind of floating. And another important thing is that you don't have objects intersecting one another from the get-go. So you want to, as you place your objects, kind of pay attention to that. Now, one thing you could do if you don't want to manually place things like I did is you could just grab all these objects, and let's actually turn off the cube here so it's not taken into account with this dynamic placement tool that I'm going to be using here. But if I use the dynamic placement tool, it's going to allow us to, if I grab this purple scale axis here, can allow us to squish everything in together, and it's going to use dynamics to place things, which is really nice. It's called the Dynamics Placement Tool, so it's very aptly named. So you can see what that looks like. And so that's one good way to be able to like place things inside of an object without manually placing things and to make sure nothing is intersecting. Okay. Let's go back and let's hit NA so we can get rid of the ground shading with lines. And again, everything's floating. So let's add some dynamic forces to kind of swirl everything around, move everything around. And the first force I'm going to use is in the simulate menu. And if we go to turbulence, and let's up the strength here. Basically, this is going to use like a type of noise to kind of add some turbulent wind to our scene. So scale is basically the size of that noise. So let's start with, say 70 and 30, and we'll hit play. And now you'll see that the turbulence is kind of moving everything around and looking good. We got a squishy object dance party going on. Looking really good. And this is just the default settings on our soft bodies here. So if we want things to be a little more squishier, we can remove the density here so things can have a little bit more give. We can also just remove some of the softness so things are a little bit more stiff. The poles are a little bit more less elastic there, and that's looking pretty nice. Now if we wanted to add some rotation in here as well, we can go ahead and use the aptly named rotation force to do just that. And the important thing to note about the rotation object is that the rotation is going to happen around this blue Z axis here. Okay, so if I go and let's just have the angular speed up to maybe 40, you are going to see all these objects start to rotate around this angular force here. Now this is a really strong force. Everything's kind of getting attracted to this axis point. One way to mitigate that is to just use a field, and I'll just add a spherical field in here. And basically inside of this spherical field is where it's going to have 100% strength of that rotation all the way to this outer wireframe sphere. So from 100% all the way to 0% strength on the outer diameter of this spherical field. And with that, we should get way less clumping together around the center here. Looking good. Things are still rotating around. Now, another cool thing you can do is have this rotational axis randomly changing and moving over time. And how we can do this is by right-clicking on the rotation object, going to animation tags, and going to vibrate. And this is basically your After Effects wiggle expression. We're just going to add some wiggly rotation here, like so. And we'll just bring the frequency or how fast that wiggles down to like 0.3. And if I turn off the connect and then turn the dynamics and just let this rotate, you can see how this axis is now rotating all around. So our rotational axis is rotating all around, which means we should get some varying rotational spin in our squishy objects here, which is looking really nice. So it just adds a little bit of variety to how things are moving around there. Now, one last thing I want to do is, everything is kind of sparse. What if I wanted to inflate these objects to help fill up this this box a little bit more? Well, I'll show you how to do that. But before we go all Willy Wonka and start inflating stuff like that violet chick turns into a blueberry, if you're liking this tutorial so far, would really appreciate it if you give it a like and smash the subscribe button, smash it really hard, because it helps me grow my channel and it alerts you anytime I post any new content. And if you want to be my new best internet friend, please leave a comment, a nice comment if you would. It helps with the old YouTube algorithms and it really helps inflate my ego. Wow, this tutorial is getting really bloated with bad jokes. All right, let's rewind to frame 0 here real quick. And remember how I was kind of, poo-pooing the balloon? I don't like the balloon. The overpressure, there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of jitter. It's pretty unstable at this point. I hope Maxon fixes it. We get these dimples. Does not look very good at all. So I've actually found a much more stable and better way to kind of inflate objects and have them expand. And that is by using this target length in not only here, but in the soft body target length as well. So what do these target lengths do? Well, remember how I said that the options here have relationships between neighboring points. So if I expand the target length here, that means that the space between the 2 points is going to expand to 135% and grow past its initial 100% original length. In the Softbody target length, let's see, 135, if I match this to 135 here as well, this is going to allow the poles, or 1 point on one side and 1 point on the other side, to also expand to 135% of its initial size or length. Okay, so with this, if I hit play, everything just explodes out. And this is kind of why the balloon has this expansion time. It doesn't just explode at frame 0, it expands over time. So we can do the same thing with the target length here, where we can have this expand over 20 frames. So if I go to frame 20, I can set a keyframe on both target lengths here, and then I can go and rewind to frame 0 and bring this back to its original 100%. There we go. And now over 20 frames, this is going to increase the target length of not only the poles, but of the target length of these points as well. Now we're expanding the object. No dimples, no explosions happening. Everything's looking really, really nice. We can also throw this connect object into a subdivision surface to smooth everything all out really nicely. And this is looking really good. Now, if we wanted everything to slide a little bit better, we could do two things. We can go to the cube and remove the friction, so things will slide against the collider cube a little better. We can also go to our friction in the surface settings here and bring that down a little bit as well. Now, the surface is very important. If you kind of zoom in here, you can see that basically the thickness here is basically a force field that prevents intersections, but if your objects are small enough, this barrier of 1.5 centimeters is a little bit too big. You're going to see these gaps. So if you see that, just bring that down to say 0.5, and that should remove those gaps in there and allow your objects to collide a little bit closer to one another. And another thing you can do is, of course, you can add some stretchiness, you can add some bounciness, you can add just a little bit of bendiness. I found just like even 0.1 gives enough wrinkles that looks pretty good on these soft body objects. You don't want to go overboard and see a little bit of wrinkly happen in there. And even, some of the dimples might happen as well. So maybe even like 0.01 for the bendiness is enough if you want a little bit of that bendiness. Let's maybe go into the soft body here. There's like so many options you can, adjust, the density. You can adjust the softness here. Maybe you just don't want zero softness at all. Again, another way to add stiffness is hitting Command and Control D, going to your sub steps. And remember, if you bring that up to 30 or you increase that, it's going to make your objects look a little bit stiffer. And of course, the dampening is going to just kind of remove energy and make things that maybe are, being too springy come to rest a little bit faster. And of course, if you're having objects intersect with each other, that's when you want to up some of these settings in the collisions. If you have any kind of weird popping, that's where you want to up the smoothing iterations. But again, anything you up in here is going to increase the simulation time, so just keep that in mind. But I would say this is looking pretty dang good. I'm really digging how this looks. And once you're happy with your simulation, you can just go ahead and before you render, I highly recommend you cache your simulation by going over to the cache tab and just hitting calculate cache. And what this is going to do is just cache your simulation, and so it's going to really play very fast in your viewport unless you're recording a tutorial on it. In that case it's going to be very slow. And one thing to keep in mind is that any kind of simulation, it's only going to use a single graphics card. So if you have dual graphics card, like I have dual 3090s, these simulations are only going to use one. Same thing with Pyro. So any particle simulation, again, all of these simulations are particle based. So it doesn't matter if you have 5 3090s, which I don't think is even possible. It's only going to use one to do these calculations. And I think with this tutorial, you might have some drop frames and stuff like that, and I apologize for that. But that's because it's only using one GPU at this point. But I'm just going to let this cache. All right, so the caching is done. So now you can just kind of scrub through and see what's going on. And I would say that maybe my object's inflated too big because they're having a tough time rotating around. So that's good to know. So what I can do is just clear that cache and then go into my timeline, grab both these target lengths second frame, and maybe just go to 130. And maybe even up the rotation angle speed here, which is the strength of the rotation. And hopefully that fixes it. But you can tweak this to your heart's content. I won't bore you with that aspect of things here. But just know that there is so many things to keep in mind when using Softbodies. Number one, you definitely want to have lower poly objects that you are then using subdivision surfaces to subdivide, or you will have those little pokey poles poking out everywhere. But with those in mind and using the target length trick to inflate everything, this is such a really cool new addition to the simulation system in Cinema 4D. It's very, very stable. If you were trying to do this in the old version of the simulation system or Softbodies, polygons would be exploding all over the place. It would just not be a pretty sight. Just exploded polygons everywhere. But I'm really digging this, having a lot of fun experimenting with this. I hope you do too. Have a squishy good time. So as you can see, the Softbody system, I think, has some little kinks to work out. That balloon thing is really killing the vibe, I think. But I think it's still pretty powerful, and it's nice to see something so stable and things aren't like exploding out all over the place and crashing Cinema 4D. But I do think you maybe have less control than the old iteration of the Softbody system, but maybe that's just me. What do you think about this new Softbody system? Leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts. I'd be really interested in hearing what you all think about it. And I really need to go because I need to look up to see if nubbins is like something really bad that I should not have even said at all. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial real soon. Until then, go out and make something.